In June 2012, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency accused Lance Armstrong, a popular American professional cyclist, of participating in a decade-long undercover doping operation with his doctor's manager and trainer. Doping is the illegal and corrupt practice of athletes using performance-enhancing drugs, or PEDs. Since the late 1990s, the seven-time Tour de France winner had been heavily using PEDs, including human growth hormone and testosterone. With overwhelming evidence of corruption present, he was eventually banned from cycling. A year later, he eventually admitted to doping on a televised interview with Oprah Winfrey, according to Samuel Abt, a scholarly researcher in an Encyclopedia Britannica article. Corruption is dishonest and fraudulent conduct by those in power in order to maintain or elevate material and social gain. The research question covered is, in what significant ways is corruption present throughout the U.S. sporting industry? Corruption is present in many significant ways, and there exists effective solutions to this important issue. Cases of corruption such as doping are not a rarity, as displayed in the graph. This is a widespread issue which must be researched because of the implications corruption has on the wider integrity of sports and ethical as well as competitive standards. Another similar theme of hidden corrupt scandals was the massive cover-up of decades of abuse in USA Gymnastics. Fumzar Malambo Nguka, in the stimulus source Empowering Women Through Sport, explains how, out of fear of losing athletic careers or public backlash, hundreds of young female athletes were sexually assaulted by gym owners, staff, and coaches in gymnastics programs. This displays another example of corruption. Female athletes were corruptly taken advantage of by staff in a multi-decade-long undercover scandal. Corruption is significantly present in U.S. college sports, especially in the NCAA's exploitation of athletes. Donna Lopiano, the president and founder of Sports Management Resources, in a peer-reviewed paper, argues how the NCAA has tax laws that give student-athletes a nonprofit status, meaning they cannot make an official salary for their labor. The amount of money the athletes actually earn is far lower than a pro athlete's salary and lower than the cost of attending college, which therefore exploits them for their labor, while the NCAA's top officials make millions, as displayed in the infographic. This displays how the NCAA is fundamentally corrupt due to the blatant exploitation the athletes receive, and this supports the solution that it requires reforms to its corrupt policies. Some possible limitations to this evidence are that many instances of corruption are currently covered up, so it is difficult to paint a complete picture. Also, this evidence is for collegiate, not pro sport. Next, corruption is also present in the U.S. pro sporting industry. Jer Longman, a scholarly author and reporter for the New York Times, explains how Salt Lake City, Utah, was the site of the 2002 Winter Olympics with many professional U.S. competitors. Investigations by an independent ethics board unearthed multi-million-dollar bribes being used to influence the choice of the Olympics location. It was discovered that the president and vice president at the time of the Salt Lake City Bid Committee and other officials secretly paid over $1 million in bribes, falsified records and documents, and diverted over $130,000 in committee money to an official of the United States Olympic Committee to bribe them to choose Salt Lake City as the site for the Olympics. The Salt Lake City scandal remains a scar in sporting integrity to this day. Another prominent form of corruption is doping. There have been countless occurrences of athletes exposed for taking PEDs, as displayed in the graph. Tom Goldman, an NPR sports correspondent, explains how in 2020, the New York Mets player, MLB, Ramachandran Khanna, was suspended for the next season due to a positive steroid test. This was his second time being caught doping, the first being when he was found using a diuretic, substance athletes sometimes take to mask the presence of a PED. The fact that this player had been caught twice for doping shows how common the practice is and how willing players are to do it. Many others have been recently caught doping as well, such as Francis Martis, a pitcher, in 2016, and Alex Rodriguez in 2012. These two pieces of evidence help reinforce the solution that the strengthening of anti-corruption agencies can help fight corruption because third-party investigations, for example an ethics board in the Salt Lake City scandal, are unbiased, so they can find and expose, therefore fighting corruption. Some limitations to this are that many instances of bribery and doping are covered up or currently happening, which makes it difficult to paint a complete picture. Also, these examples only cover pro sport and not collegiate. There are some current solutions that have already been tried and proven mostly ineffective to solving the issue of corruption in U.S. sports. A significant one is the use of public awareness campaigns to increase education about and stop corruption. This is mostly ineffective because there is very little the general public can do to reduce corruption, as decisions are primarily controlled by the elites in the organizations, according to Donna Lopiano. These elites have no reason to stop their practices which make them rich and powerful, and practical strength is needed to enforce anti-corruption, which is just not possible in these kinds of solutions. However, my two solutions are the most effective ones to tackling corruption in U.S. sports. First, corruption in the collegiate industry can be fought using critical reforms to the NCAA and eliminating the amateurism rule, which is the organization's law that stops student athletes from being paid real salaries and thus is the cause of so much corruption in the form of bribery. Money is distributed under the table, creating a market for illicit payments, according to Andrea Closa, a scholarly researcher in a peer reviewed paper. The NCAA controls most collegiate sports, so enacting reforms to reduce corruption and eliminating the amateurism rule will fix a lot of this corruption due to athletes being paid and not having a need for bribery. Some may argue that it will not do anything to fight corruption in pro sports and that reforms are ineffective. However, this solution, being smaller in scope, is effective in its own boundaries, and what it does not cover is handled by the second solution, which is on a larger scale. Also, reforms to sporting organizations have been made in the past and shown to be successful, as demonstrated with Title IX, which were laws passed to reduce sexual discrimination in sport and did so effectively, according to the U.S. Department of Education. To ensure the first solution works, intervention is required by a capable third party, the government, to ensure reforms are met. When this goes into effect, the corrupt policies, most significantly the amateurism rule, will be changed, reducing corruption within the NCAA and collegiate sports. The second solution, on a wider scope, is the strengthening of anti-corruption agencies, which have already been proven earlier to be effective in finding instances of corruption and fighting it. They also act as a great deterrent against corrupt actors, as the fear of being caught is too great for many, thus actually reducing the likelihood of corrupt practices. Some may argue that ACAs are very expensive to run. However, the benefits outweigh the costs, and ACAs like USADA have exposed hundreds of cases of doping, preventing them from becoming out of control, which can then be very expensive to handle and hurt reputation, fans, and revenue. Thus, ACAs save resources in the long run. To ensure this second solution works, the government is also needed. Government funding must be allocated towards supporting ACAs. They will then investigate and scrutinize sports leagues and organizations, exposing corrupt practices in the process and setting the stage for less corruption overall. While no method will ever completely stop corrupt acts from taking place in sports, it is human nature, after all, according to George Orwell in the stimulus source, The Sporting Spirit. These two solutions will go in great lengths toward fighting corruption and returning purity to the U.S. sporting industry as a whole. In conclusion, corruption exists in many ways in the U.S. sporting industry, but there are steps we can take to fix these issues. Okay, now I'm going to go over my oral defense questions. So first of all, oral defense question 1C. How did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process? As I moved through the research process, my question changed to accommodate a wider scale of research and a different topic. It started out with women in U.S. sports to corruption in U.S. sports. I started with researching women's role in sports and how they are discriminated against, and the instances of gender discrimination that I found actually reflected a larger problem in the sporting industry that had to do with corruption. And I ended up researching corruption in sports because it has so much influence on everything, all the outcomes. For example, discrimination against women. For example, sexual abuse scandals, which are discrimination against women, were the result of embedded corruption. Oral defense question 2C. How is your conclusion in conversation with the body of literature or other resources you examined? Other research sources you examined. My conclusion is in conversation with the other research and bodies of literature in terms of my proposed solutions of reforming the NCAA. There have been many literary works and research, as well as public discussions, especially in mass media, about collegiate sports corruption, and my conclusions very much side with that larger body. In my research, I found absolute corruption just embedded within college sport, which is a massive issue, and this has long been the subject of news reports. For example, my conclusions of getting rid of the amateurism rule reflect a lot of the concerns about the rule in the body of literature. Many other researchers have discussed this also in terms of corruption, like Donna Lopiano, discussing the NCAA's exploitive policies. My conclusions thus supplement the larger body of research on this topic. Thank you.